a steady rhythm that crackled through the airwaves of the late 1970s. Tap, 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 10 times a second. A mechanical heartbeat that interrupted radio broadcasts, jammed communication lines, and haunted shortwave frequencies around the world. Ham radio operators first heard it in 1976. They called it the Russian Woodpecker. It was too regular to be interference, too deliberate to be an accident. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. No one knew what it was. Some thought it was a signal from deep space. Others believed it was a secret Soviet mind control experiment or a radar scanning the skies for missiles. A few insisted it was something even stranger, a communication link between Earth and a hidden weapon orbiting above. Whatever it was, it became the most infamous sound of the Cold War. Everywhere it was heard, it brought the same reaction, unease. It broke into air traffic communications, military channels, and even commercial radio. The tapping was relentless, rhythmic, almost biological. It sounded like a living thing, a pulse beneath the static of the modern world. The truth, as it turned out, was both simpler and more terrifying. The sound came from a place that didn't officially exist, a secret Soviet military installation buried in the forest near Chernobyl. A structure so large, so alien in appearance, that when Western satellites first photographed it, they couldn't identify what it was. It rose hundreds of feet into the air, an iron wall against the sky, a lattice of steel beams, miles wide, glistening in the fog like the skeleton of a god. Its name was Duga. In Russian, the word means arc. To the Soviet military, it was part of a radar network known as over-the-horizon detection, a technology meant to give the USSR advance warning of nuclear attack. But to the outside world, it became something else entirely, a symbol of paranoia, secrecy, and the invisible architecture of fear that defined the Cold War. Duga wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It didn't fire missiles or bullets. It fired waves, bursts of electromagnetic energy that bounced off the ionosphere and returned to Earth thousands of miles away. In theory, those reflections could detect the exhaust of American missiles seconds after launch. In practice, they created a global ghost, a sound that couldn't be silenced. To understand why the Soviet Union built it, you have to understand the fear that ruled the world at the time. By the 1970s, the balance of terror between East and West had reached a kind of symmetry. Both sides possessed enough nuclear firepower to annihilate the planet several times over. Each had early warning systems that could detect an incoming strike within minutes. But minutes weren't enough. If the United States launched a surprise attack, Soviet radars, limited by the curvature of the Earth, might not see it until it was too late. The U.S. had built a line of satellites to watch the skies. The Soviets, lacking that space infrastructure, turned to radio waves. The Duga radar would change that. It would see over the horizon, bouncing signals off the atmosphere, turning the sky itself into a mirror. It was an engineering marvel, a structure of almost mythic proportions. Its array stretched nearly half a kilometer long and stood taller than the Statue of Liberty. The transmitter complex, located hundreds of kilometers away, consumed as much power as a small city. But its purpose was simple: to listen for the end of the world. In the USSR's defense doctrine, time was everything. Detecting a U.S. launch even 30 seconds earlier could mean the difference between retaliation and annihilation. Duga's operators sat in underground command rooms surrounded by oscilloscopes, cathode screens, and constantly shifting lines of code. Every movement in the ionosphere, every flicker of signal might be the beginning of the end. And so the radar pulsed, constantly, endlessly, a giant metal heart beating in time with global paranoia. Western governments were desperate to know what it was. NATO intelligence analysts traced the signal's origin to Soviet territory but couldn't determine its function. The tapping was so powerful it disrupted Western military communications, commercial radio, and even TV broadcasts. Some accused the USSR of deliberate interference, a new form of electronic warfare. Others feared something even more sinister, that the signal was designed to influence minds. By 1977, conspiracy theories had spread across Europe and North America. Newspapers ran headlines about a Soviet brainwave weapon. Talk shows invited self-proclaimed experts who claimed the signal was altering weather patterns or weakening human immune systems. A Canadian scientist published a report suggesting the frequency could affect human brain activity. In the absence of information, imagination filled the void. Shortwave listeners began sharing recordings of the woodpecker. Some claimed the sound changed tone when major political events occurred, as if the signal were responding to world events. A few fringe theorists said they could hear patterns, almost musical sequences, hidden in the noise. To the average person, it was an invisible ghost haunting the modern world. To the Soviet engineers working in secret near Chernobyl, it was just another project, one more piece in the endless machinery of deterrence. The men and women stationed at the Duga site lived inside the Cold War's strangest contradiction, surrounded by immense power, yet trapped in obscurity. Their work was classified. Their families couldn't know what they did. The massive antenna stood just beyond the horizon of the nearby Pripyat River, fenced off by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers who rarely spoke. They called it the Steel Forest. Life there was monotonous but tense. Every day, technicians adjusted the transmitter's power levels, tuning the signal to pierce the shifting layers of the ionosphere. The system was notoriously unstable. Sometimes the waves reflected perfectly, reaching halfway across the planet. Other times they scattered chaotically, creating bursts of static that jammed their own receivers. When that happened, the operators had no way to know if it was natural interference or something worse. More than once, the Duga's computers picked up anomalies. Faint, rising echoes in the static, ghostly trails that seemed to move against the background noise. Each time the readings were logged and investigated. The reports never left the compound. The irony is that for all its size, for all its mystery, Duga never really worked the way it was meant to. The ionosphere was too unpredictable. Solar storms distorted the signals, and atmospheric shifts scattered the reflections. While the U.S. relied on satellites with near-instant accuracy, Duga's readings were often vague, delayed, or false. But in the Soviet system, failure wasn't an option you could admit. The radar remained operational because it had to be. Billions of rubles had been poured into its construction. Thousands of workers had labored in secrecy for years to raise the towers. It was too big to abandon. So it kept tapping. Even when its data proved unreliable, even when its interference caused international outrage, Duga stayed online, because in the logic of the Cold War, the appearance of vigilance was almost as important as vigilance itself. If the Americans thought the Soviets had a working over-the-horizon radar, it would add another layer of uncertainty to their strategy. And uncertainty, in the nuclear balance, was power. For nearly a decade, the woodpecker signal pulsed through the atmosphere. Engineers in Europe built devices to filter it out. Radio hobbyists tracked its direction as it shifted with the ionosphere. And then, suddenly, in 1989, it stopped. No warning, no final transmission. The woodpecker went silent. At first, no one knew why. Western intelligence assumed it was a technological upgrade, that the Soviets had switched to new, undisclosed systems. Others speculated it had finally been shut down after international pressure. The truth was stranger. In 1986, just a few kilometers away, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The radiation plume drifted across Europe, poisoning the forests, the rivers, and the small military town that had grown around the Duga installation. The engineers who manned the radar were among the first responders, ordered to stay at their posts even as the fallout thickened the air. Some stayed until they collapsed. Others fled in silence, abandoning the consoles mid-shift. The system shut down not by command but by contamination. The still forest fell quiet. The last log entries from the Duga command center are hauntingly ordinary. Signal unstable. Power fluctuation detected. Restart cycle in progress. Then nothing. When soldiers returned months later, wearing protective suits and respirators, they found the complex still intact, lights dimly flickering from backup generators, papers scattered across consoles, screens burned with static. The radar towers still loomed outside, their frames stained by rust and rain, their cables swaying in the wind like the strings of an ancient instrument. The woodpecker was dead, but its echo never stopped. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded, it did more than scatter radiation, it erased an entire world. The small, secret towns that had supported the plant and the Duga complex were abandoned almost overnight. Soldiers sealed the area, evacuated civilians, and drew a 30-kilometer circle on the map that became known as the exclusion zone, a zone the living no longer entered without permission. And inside that forbidden zone, the Duga towers still stood. For a time, they were invisible to history. Soviet authorities didn't mention them in public reports. Western journalists, barred from entering the zone, could only speculate. To most of the world, the woodpecker had simply fallen silent. But silence has its own gravity. The absence of a sound that had once filled the airwaves became a mystery people couldn't let go of. Radio enthusiasts kept listening. They scanned the bands late into the night, hoping to hear the woodpecker's rhythmic tapping again, the ghost in the static. Some claimed they did. There were scattered reports of faint pulses, bursts of energy echoing on the same frequency, weaker but still there. No one could confirm their source. Others began inventing stories to explain what had happened. In the years after the Soviet Union's collapse, rumors about the Duga spread like radiation through the ruins. People said the radar had never been a missile detector at all, that it was an experimental psychotronic weapon designed to broadcast low-frequency waves capable of influencing human thought. They said it could control moods, cause depression, even sway political opinions. The collapse of the USSR, they whispered, wasn't the result of economics or ideology, but of exposure to its own creation. The woodpecker had turned on its masters. Of course, none of that was true. The radar was never meant to target mines, only missiles. But truth doesn't stand a chance against mystery, and Duga became the perfect symbol for a new era of uncertainty. In the 1990s, as Western journalists finally entered the Chernobyl zone, they found the towers exactly as they had been left, silent, immense, and rusting in the northern wind. Standing at their base, you could hear the wind moan through the steel lattice, a hollow metallic whine that sounded disturbingly like the old woodpecker signal itself. The first descriptions that reached the outside world were almost poetic. One reporter wrote, "It looks like something built not by men, but by time." Another said, "It's as if the earth grew an antenna to call for help." For the people who saw it, the structure was hypnotic. The sheer size defied comprehension. You could walk for minutes beneath its shadow and never reach the other end. The panels climbed higher than the eye could follow, vanishing into the gray sky. It was beautiful, in a terrifying way. The ruins of a civilization that had tried to listen for danger and ended up broadcasting its own. Over time, the Duga towers became a kind of monument, not officially, but spiritually. They symbolized everything about the late Soviet era: ambition, paranoia, secrecy, and decay. The Cold War had been fought not just with bombs and propaganda, but with signals, invisible, inaudible, everywhere. The woodpecker was the ghost of that invisible war, a relic of the belief that if you could hear your enemy, you could survive him. Visitors began sneaking into the zone to see it. Urban explorers, photographers, thrill-seekers. They trekked through the forests around Chernobyl, past crumbling checkpoints and wild dogs, to stand beneath a skeleton of steel that once tapped its heartbeat across the world. They climbed it, dangerously, stupidly, for the view. From the top, the forest below looked endless, a green ocean swallowing the ruins of human ambition. In the distance, the gray sarcophagus of the Chernobyl reactor shimmered under the haze, a monument to another kind of disaster. For years, the Duga site was almost forgotten by governments but worshipped by the curious. Every person who stood before it seemed to feel the same thing, a sense that it shouldn't exist, that it was too large, too silent, too purposeful to be just a pile of metal. Some said they could feel electricity in the air. Others claimed their compasses spun. The myths only grew from there. In 2015, a Ukrainian documentary called The Russian Woodpecker reignited the legend. The film followed an artist named Fedor Alexandrovich who had grown up near Chernobyl and believed the Duga radar was secretly connected to the nuclear disaster itself. His theory was that the explosion wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate cover-up to destroy evidence of the radar's failure. There's no real proof of that, of course. But the theory captured people's imagination. It merged two of the Cold War's greatest icons, the reactor and the radar, into a single story of corruption, secrecy, and self-destruction. In truth, Duga and Chernobyl were already linked by geography and destiny. The power plant had been built partly to supply electricity to the radar. When the reactor blew, it starved Duga of the energy it needed to operate. One disaster killed the other. But it's easy to see why people wanted a deeper connection. Both sites represented the same madness, the obsession with control. The idea that if you could monitor every variable, predict every signal, you could master chaos. And both ended the same way, silent, abandoned, leaking poison into the earth. When the Cold War ended, the woodpecker vanished from the air, but its spirit found a new life online. In the early 2000s, as the internet spread, recordings of the signal resurfaced on YouTube and archive sites. Amateur historians uploaded hours of audio, spectrograms, and decoded data. Forums debated its purpose all over again. To a new generation raised on digital mystery, the Duga signal became an early analog myth, the prototype for creepypastas and number stations, those strange broadcasts of monotone voices reading endless strings of numbers. The woodpecker fit perfectly into that lineage of Cold War hauntings, technologies built to defend humanity that ended up spooking it instead. Even today, the phrase Russian woodpecker still appears on conspiracy forums and paranormal YouTube channels. People swear they've heard echoes of it again on modern radio bands, though experts dismiss it as atmospheric noise or stray harmonics from newer radars. But in the cultural imagination, the woodpecker has become something more than a sound. It's an omen. A reminder that the hum of technology always carries the potential for dread. In that sense, Duga never died. It evolved. Because its true function, to detect the invisible, to make fear measurable, is the same function every surveillance system serves today. Duga was the ancestor of satellites, wiretaps, digital tracking. Its bones may rust, but its descendants fill our sky. Every ping of a cell tower, every echo of a Wi-Fi signal, every heartbeat of a server farm, they're all modern versions of the woodpecker's pulse. The only difference is that now, we don't find it strange. The Duga radar was built to listen for missiles. But in a way, it ended up listening for us. Standing in the shadow of its frame today, you can still hear something if you stop and wait. A faint vibration in the air, the sound of wind scraping against steel, repeating endlessly. Tap, tap, tap. It's easy to imagine that it's still listening. Even as the forest reclaims the land, as moss climbs the concrete bunkers and foxes prowl the overgrown roads, the radar towers remain untouched. The steel has darkened, but it hasn't fallen. Decades of snow and rain have failed to break it. From above, it still looks like a colossal barcode printed onto the planet, an alien artifact half swallowed by time. It's a monument to paranoia that outlasted the politics that built it. In 2016, Ukrainian officials debated demolishing the structure, citing safety concerns. The public reaction was immediate outrage. Even though it had once jammed the world's airwaves, even though it was built to feed an arms race, people didn't want it gone. They wanted it to stay, as a relic, a warning, and a wonder. Today, the Duga radar is officially listed as a cultural heritage site. You can visit it on guided tours into the exclusion zone. The buses park near the base, and visitors walk beneath the rusted beams, craning their necks upward like worshippers in a cathedral. The guides tell stories, some true, some not. They point to the command buildings, the generator rooms, the control panels frozen in time. And when they stop speaking, the silence feels heavy, as if the tower itself is waiting for someone to switch it back on. Every year, the number of visitors grows. Photographers, historians, YouTubers, even wedding parties, all drawn to the allure of this impossible machine that once reached across continents through invisible waves. The irony is inescapable. The Duga was meant to detect nuclear war. Instead, it became a monument to the peace that followed, fragile, haunted, and never quite silent. Its story is the story of the Cold War itself. A machine built to prevent death that became, in time, a shrine to it. There's a strange kind of immortality in noise. Even when the machines that make it go quiet, the memory of the sound lingers, like a vibration that never fades completely. The woodpecker was silenced decades ago, but its rhythm still beats somewhere in the collective subconscious. The Cold War ended, but the signal never stopped. It just changed frequency. For those who lived through its era, the sound meant tension, secrecy, and a sky full of unseen dangers. But for those born later, it means something different, an echo of a world that was both simpler and infinitely more terrifying. When you listen to the old recordings today, there's something hypnotic about them. That repetitive tapping, steady as breath, feels alive in a way modern signals don't. It sounds less like data and more like something that wants to be heard. The Duga towers were built for one purpose: to listen, to stretch the Soviet Union's ears across the curvature of the earth, to catch the faint tremor of an American missile launch before it was too late. Yet, in the end, what they captured wasn't a signal from the enemy. It was the heartbeat of human fear. Every nation that built a weapon in the Cold War shared the same obsession, the idea that knowledge could defeat death. That if you could see far enough, detect fast enough, calculate deep enough, you could survive the apocalypse. The Duga radar was just one expression of that dream, an enormous monument to the illusion of control. But control is a mirage. The truth is that the Duga never worked perfectly. It couldn't. The atmosphere is chaotic, alive, constantly shifting. The very medium it depended on, the ionosphere, was unpredictable. Its failures were built into its design. But the machine's value was never purely technical. It was psychological. It gave the illusion that someone, somewhere was watching the skies, that humanity hadn't completely surrendered to chance. That illusion still exists. Today, we live surrounded by machines that listen, record, and interpret, not for missiles, but for us. Satellites track our movements, algorithms watch our spending, our searches, our conversations. Every tap on a touchscreen is a small echo of the woodpecker, a pulse of information sent into the invisible ether. And like the Duga, the purpose of these systems isn't always clear. They promise safety, stability, efficiency. But at their core, they run on the same logic that built the Cold War, the belief that if you can collect enough data, you can predict disaster before it happens. It's a comforting idea, and a dangerous one. Because as the Soviets learned, when you build machines to detect fear, they eventually start producing it. The Duga radar made the entire planet nervous. Modern systems do the same. We just don't call them weapons anymore. The woodpecker's legacy is everywhere, in airport scanners, in early warning networks, in the quiet hum of routers and servers. The Cold War taught us to listen endlessly, to never stop scanning the horizon. We traded the sound of static for the silence of algorithms, but the feeling is the same. The same paranoia, repackaged as progress. If the Duga had a soul, and standing beneath it, you might believe it did, it was built out of vigilance. It was the purest embodiment of what the Cold War demanded: never rest, never stop listening, never stop preparing for an attack that might never come. And yet, even in silence, it endures. In 2020, a Ukrainian sound artist recorded hours of wind whistling through the Duga's steel ribs. He filtered and layered the tones until the composition began to sound like the original woodpecker pulse. When he released it online, people around the world described it as comforting, as if that old heartbeat had returned to reassure them that some things never change. That's the paradox of the Cold War. It terrified an entire generation, and yet there's nostalgia in its noise. The constant vigilance became a kind of background music for life, a sound you could depend on, even as it threatened to destroy you. Maybe that's why people keep returning to the Duga. They come from all over: historians, drone pilots, influencers, soldiers on leave, to walk beneath its towers and feel small. They photograph the staircases that lead nowhere, the dials frozen mid-turn, the peeling murals that still show Soviet cosmonauts reaching toward the stars. And in the quiet of that steel labyrinth, they feel something like awe. It's the same feeling ancient people must have felt standing before the ruins of temples, the sense that this, whatever it was, mattered, that it was built with faith and fear and purpose. The Duga isn't just a machine, it's a confession. It confesses that for all our intelligence, humanity still builds things we can't entirely explain or control, that our greatest achievements often come from our deepest anxieties, that we'll spend billions trying to outsmart destruction, even when we know destruction is the one thing we can't perfect. Standing beneath its rusted frame today, you can see how the forest has started to reclaim it. Trees grow through the ladders, moss coats the concrete. Birds nest in the signal dishes. The natural world is slowly consuming this monument to human fear, as if erasing the record of our madness. But it's not gone, it's just sleeping. The same frequencies the woodpecker once used still pulse across the ionosphere, now carrying data, television, weather reports, drone telemetry. The airwaves are more crowded than ever. The sky is louder. The signals are endless. If you could strip away the content, the words, the images, the music, and just listen to the raw pulse of it all, it would probably sound familiar. A steady rhythm, 10 times a second. Tap, tap. That's the same sound the world heard in 1976, echoing across a planet divided by fear. Only now, no one notices it anymore. That's the irony of the woodpecker. It was hated in its time for interrupting the world's noise, but now, we've built a world so loud that it could never be heard again. And maybe that's fitting. The Duga was never meant to be understood. It was meant to stand as a warning, not just to enemies, but to the people who built it. A warning that every defense eventually becomes a monument. That every effort to control fear eventually feeds it. The Cold War taught us that absolute security is a myth. The Duga reminds us that the search for it never ends. There's a certain poetry in that. The machine built to detect the end of the world never saw it, because it was too busy waiting. The world didn't end. The tower still stands. And the silence it left behind is louder than its signal ever was. The Soviet Union may have vanished, but the impulse that created Duga, to listen endlessly, to prepare endlessly, to live in the shadow of unseen threats, survived into the digital age. Today, we don't build giant antennas to scan the skies. We build networks, satellites, and algorithms to scan each other. The signal never stopped. We just tuned it inward. And so, somewhere in the forests of northern Ukraine, the great steel skeleton of the Duga still hums with the wind, a ghost machine built to hear apocalypse, now reduced to music. The woodpecker is gone, but the echo remains. Because in the end, the Cold War never truly ended, it just went wireless. The Duga, the radio tower that haunted the Cold War, the sound of a world that never stopped listening.